You're not in charge, you're just background noise.
Try that, and you'll regret it with every bite you take.
Bullies messed with the new teacher, then her TAEKWONDO black belt destroyed them. The fluorescent lights of Washington High School cast harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floors as the first bell of the new academic year echoed through empty hallways. Located in a working-class suburb of Chicago, the school had earned a reputation that parents whispered about in grocery store aisles and teachers discussed in hushed tones during faculty meetings. This was where troubled kids came to finish their education, where overcrowded classrooms and understaffed programs created perfect breeding grounds for the kind of behavior that made headlines. Sarah Miller stood outside room 237, her hand resting on the door handle as she took a deep breath. At 29, she possessed the kind of quiet confidence that came from surviving challenges most people never faced. Her modest height and unassuming appearance, crisp white blouse, sensible flats, light brown hair pulled back in a professional bun, gave her the look of someone who might be easily overlooked or more dangerously easily intimidated. But Sarah Miller carried secrets that didn't show on the surface. She pushed open the door and stepped into her new classroom, where 26 10th graders sat in various states of disinterest and defiance. The energy in the room was immediately hostile, arms crossed. Heads turned away, the unmistakable body language of students who had already decided their new English teacher wasn't worth their attention. At the back of the classroom, 3 boys dominated the space like wolves marking territory. Jake Morrison, 17, and built like a linebacker despite his age, slouched in his chair with the kind of arrogant smirk that suggested he'd never met a consequence he couldn't charm or intimidate his way out of. His followers Tom Bradley and Liam Chen flanked him with the eager loyalty of smaller predators following an alpha. "Good morning, class," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "I'm Ms. Miller, and I'm excited to be your English teacher this year." Jake's hands shot up, not in a gesture of participation, but in preparation for disruption. Without waiting to be called on, he crumpled a piece of paper into a tight ball and launched it directly at Sarah's head. It struck her temple with enough force to knock a strand of hair loose from her careful arrangement. The classroom erupted in laughter, not the innocent mirth of children enjoying a joke, but the cruel entertainment of adolescent predators sensing weakness. Jake leaned back in his chair, his grin widening as he basked in the attention. "Oops," he said, his voice dripping with false innocence. "Sorry, Teach, my hand slipped." Sarah bent calmly to retrieve the paper ball, her movements deliberate and controlled. She walked to Jake's desk and placed the crumpled paper directly in front of him, her eyes meeting his with steady intensity. "Thank you for the warm welcome, Jake," she said quietly. "Now everyone, please open your textbooks to page 15. We're going to start with a discussion about power, what it means, how it's used, and what happens when it's abused." Something in her tone made Jake's smirk falter slightly, though he quickly recovered his composure. "Power, huh, sounds boring, Teach. Maybe you should find something more interesting to talk about." Sarah returned to the front of the classroom, but her posture had subtly shifted. Where moments before she had appeared entirely professional and approachable, now there was something coiled about her stance, like a cat that had spotted movement in tall grass. "Power is never boring, Jake," she replied, "especially when it's in the wrong hands. Shuri." The rest of the class period proceeded with constant low-level disruption. Jake and his friends whispered loudly during Sarah's attempts to lead discussion, made exaggerated yawning sounds during her explanations, and turned every question into an opportunity for sarcasm or outright disrespect. But Sarah noticed other things too. Emma Rodriguez, a small girl with intelligent eyes who sat near the front, kept glancing apologetically at Sarah whenever Jake acted out. Marcus Thompson, a quiet boy in the middle row, seemed genuinely interested in the lesson, but stayed silent to avoid drawing the bully's attention. These students, Sarah realized, were being held hostage by Jake's reign of terror just as much as she was. When the bell rang, the students filed out with the usual chaos of teenagers changing classes. Sarah began erasing the board, but when she opened her desk drawer to put away her markers, she found a folded piece of paper that hadn't been there before. The message, written in block letters that suggested an attempt to disguise handwriting, was simple and direct. "Leave now while you still can. You don't belong here." Sarah stared at the note for a long moment, her fingers tightening around the paper. Then very deliberately, she folded it neatly and placed it in her planner. If someone wanted to play psychological warfare, she was prepared to engage on that battlefield. What they didn't know was that Sarah Miller had been preparing for this kind of fight her entire life. The harassment escalated over the following days with the methodical precision of a military campaign. Sarah arrived each morning to find her classroom in varying states of disarray, desks rearranged into crude symbols, textbooks hidden or damaged, her personal supplies mysteriously vanishing. The whiteboard frequently bore messages that had to be quickly erased before other students could see them, ranging from childish insults to more serious threats. Jake and his crew seemed to view her as a fascinating experiment in human endurance. They tested boundaries daily, each incident carefully calibrated to stay just below the threshold that would trigger serious administrative intervention. They were smart enough to know the system and experienced enough to exploit its weaknesses. During class, they maintained a constant stream of disruption that made teaching nearly impossible. Papers would rustle loudly whenever Sarah tried to speak. Chairs would scrape against the floor in orchestrated cacophony. Questions would be asked not out of genuine curiosity, but as setups for jokes that would send the back of the classroom into eruptions of laughter. But Sarah noticed something else during these difficult first weeks. The other students were watching her carefully, waiting to see how she would respond. Emma Rodriguez started staying after class to help clean up the mess left by the bullies, her actions, speaking louder than words about where her loyalties lay. Marcus Thompson began making small attempts to participate in class discussions, his courage growing as he watched Sarah maintain her composure under pressure. "Ms. Miller," Emma said quietly one afternoon as she helped stack scattered textbooks, "why don't you report them? Everyone knows what they're doing." Sarah paused in her work, considering her response carefully. "Sometimes, Emma, the best way to deal with bullies isn't to run to someone else for help. Sometimes you have to show them that you're stronger than they think you are." Emma looked puzzled. "But how can you be stronger? Jake's huge, and there are 3 of them." Sarah smiled, and for just a moment, Emma caught a glimpse of something fierce and confident in her teacher's eyes. "Strength comes in many forms, sweetheart. Physical size is just one kind, and it's not always the most important kind." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Jake appeared in the doorway, his usual swagger slightly more pronounced than usual. He'd clearly been waiting for the classroom to empty so he could have Sarah to himself. "Still here, Teach?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. Most teachers would have quit by now. Must be pretty desperate for a job to stick around after. Well, after everything. Sarah straightened to her full height, which brought her to roughly Jake's shoulder level. "I don't quit, Jake. It's not in my nature." "Everyone has a breaking point," Jake replied, stepping fully into the classroom. His friends Tom and Liam appeared behind him, forming a semicircle that effectively blocked the exit. "Maybe you just haven't found yours yet." Emma pressed closer to Sarah's side, clearly frightened by the sudden shift in atmosphere. Sarah placed a protective hand on the girl's shoulder while keeping her eyes fixed on Jake. "Emma," Sarah said calmly, "why don't you head home? I'll see you tomorrow." "But Ms. Miller." "It's okay," Sarah assured her. "Mr. Morrison and I are just going to have a little chat about boundaries and consequences." Emma hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave her teacher alone with the 3 boys. But something in Sarah's tone brooked no argument. The girl gathered her backpack and hurried past the boys, who stepped aside just enough to let her pass, while maintaining their intimidating formation. When the sound of Emma's footsteps faded down the hallway, Jake's demeanor shifted from casual menace to something more direct and threatening. "Here's the thing, Teach," he said, his voice dropping to a more serious register. "This is our school, our territory. We decide who stays and who goes, and we've decided that you don't fit." Sarah moved to her desk, opening the top drawer as if looking for something. "I see. And what exactly are you planning to do about that, Jake?" "Whatever it takes," Tom chimed in, emboldened by what he perceived as Sarah's calm acceptance of their threat. "We know where you park your car," Liam added. "We know what time you leave. We can make your life very difficult if you don't make the smart choice." Sarah found what she was looking for in her desk drawer, her phone. With movements so casual they seemed almost absent-minded, she activated the voice recording app and set the device on top of the desk. "And what would you consider the smart choice?" she asked. Jake stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could smell the cheap cologne he wore to mask the scent of cigarettes. "Find another job, another school, Somewhere they need weak teachers who can't handle real students? Interesting, Sarah mused. So you're threatening me, attempting to intimidate me into leaving my job and doing it all while recording devices are present. Do you boys understand that what you're describing constitutes criminal harassment? Potentially assault if you follow through on any of these threats? The three boys exchanged glances, suddenly less certain of themselves. They hadn't expected their new teacher to respond with legal terminology and calm analysis of their behavior. You can't prove anything, Jake said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Sarah picked up her phone and stopped the recording. Actually, I can. I've been documenting everything since day one. Every incident, every threat, every act of vandalism. And now I have your own voices spelling out your intentions. She moved around her desk, no longer maintaining the careful distance she'd kept throughout their confrontation. Jake was still larger than her, still flanked by his friends, but something fundamental had shifted in the power dynamic of the room. So here's what's going to happen. Sarah continued, her voice taking on an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her professional training. You're going to stop this harassment immediately. You're going to treat me, your classmates, in this classroom with respect. And you're going to start acting like the young men you have the potential to become instead of the bullies you've chosen to be. Jake's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. Or what? You'll run crying to the principal, get us suspended. We've been suspended before, lady. It's like a vacation. Oh, Jake, Sarah said, and her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I'm not going to the principal. Not yet, anyway. First, I'm going to give you boys a chance to learn some manners the hard way. Before any of them could ask what she meant, Sarah was already walking toward the door. She paused at the threshold and looked back at the three boys who stood frozen in confusion and growing unease. Tomorrow after school, she said. Gymnasium. If you really want to settle this question of who runs what around here, we'll settle it properly. Just make sure you're prepared for the answer. Word spread through Washington High School with the speed that only teenage gossip could achieve. By the end of the next day, whispers followed Sarah through the hallways like a wake behind a ship. Students clustered at lockers and in corners, debating whether the quiet English teacher had finally snapped or if she had some kind of plan that nobody could figure out. Jake Morrison found himself in the unusual position of being uncertain about his next move. The confrontation he'd initiated had somehow turned into a challenge he couldn't back down from without losing face. But something about Sarah Miller's calm confidence made him deeply uneasy. She hadn't seemed frightened by their threats. If anything, she'd seemed almost pleased. Maybe we should just forget about it, Tom suggested as the three friends huddled in the school parking lot after classes ended. She's probably just bluffing. Teachers can't actually fight students, she'd get fired. That's exactly why we have to show up, Jake replied, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. She thinks she's so smart playing mind games with us. Time to show her what happens when you mess with the wrong people. Liam nodded agreement, but his enthusiasm seemed forced. Yeah, totally. 3 against 1. She's crazy if she thinks she can take us. But as they made their way toward the gymnasium, all three boys felt the weight of something they couldn't quite identify. Other students were following at a distance, drawn by the promise of drama, but unwilling to get too close to whatever was about to unfold. The gymnasium was officially closed after school hours, but Jake had learned years ago how to jimmy the side door that led directly onto the basketball court. The vast space was dimly lit by emergency lighting, creating an atmosphere that felt more like an arena than a school facility. Sarah Miller was already there waiting. She stood in the center of the court, but she no longer looked like the soft-spoken English teacher who had walked into their classroom 3 weeks ago. Gone were the professional blouse and conservative skirt, replaced by a traditional white taekwondo uniform that seemed to glow in the gymnasium's subdued lighting. A black belt was tied around her waist with the kind of precision that spoke of years of practice and discipline. Jake stopped short, his confidence evaporating like water on hot concrete. What the hell is this? Sarah replied, her voice carrying clearly across the empty space. Is what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. Tom and Liam flanked Jake, but their earlier bravado had disappeared entirely. The woman standing before them bore little resemblance to the teacher they'd been tormenting. Her posture radiated controlled power, Her movements were fluid and purposeful, and her eyes held the kind of focused intensity that made it clear she was no longer playing games. "You boys wanted to settle the question of who runs things around here," Sarah continued. "So let's settle it. All three of you if you think you're up to it. Or you can apologize for your behavior, accept detention for the rest of the semester, and we can pretend this never happened." Jake felt the eyes of the other students who had followed them into the gymnasium. Some were recording with their phones, capturing what would either be his moment of triumph or his complete humiliation. The choice was no longer his to make. He'd already committed to this confrontation the moment he'd decided to make Sarah Miller's life miserable. "You're insane if you think we're going to fight some crazy teacher," he said, but he was already moving forward, his fists clenched. "I'm not asking you to fight a teacher," Sarah replied, settling into a fighting stance that looked as natural as breathing. "I'm giving you the chance to fight someone who can fight back." Jake rushed forward with the kind of wild, undisciplined charge that had intimidated smaller students for years. He was bigger than Sarah, stronger in terms of raw muscle mass, and accustomed to using his size advantage to overwhelm opponents before they could mount any kind of defense. He never saw the kick coming. Sarah's movement was so fluid and precise that it seemed almost choreographed. She pivoted on her left foot, her right leg sweeping up in a perfect arc that caught Jake in the solar plexus with the precision of a surgical strike. The impact lifted him off his feet and sent him crashing to the gymnasium floor, gasping for breath and clutching his stomach. Tom and Liam stared in shock for a moment before their pack mentality kicked in. They rushed Sarah from opposite sides, thinking to overwhelm her with numbers and coordination. Sarah's response was a clinic in applied martial arts technique. She caught Tom's wild swing with a deflection that redirected his momentum, using his own force to send him stumbling past her and into a controlled throw that put him on the ground beside Jake. Liam's attempt to tackle her from behind was countered with an elbow strike that doubled him over, followed by a sweep that took his legs out from under him. In less than 30 seconds, all three boys were on the floor of the gymnasium, staring up at Sarah Miller with expressions of pure disbelief. She stood over them, barely breathing hard, her uniform still perfectly neat and her black belt properly positioned. "Now," she said, her voice calm and professional, "let's have a conversation about respect, consequences, and the difference between being strong and being a bully." The gymnasium was silent, except for the sound of the boys' labored breathing and the subtle electronic beeps of phones recording the aftermath. Sarah walked to the bleachers and retrieved a water bottle, taking a small sip before returning to where the three bullies lay sprawled on the floor. "Jake," she said, extending her hand to help him up, "tell me why you really started targeting me." Jake Morrison had never been helped to his feet by someone who had just put him on the floor. The cognitive dissonance of the moment, the gentleness of Sarah's assistance combined with the devastating effectiveness of her defense, left him struggling to process what had just happened. He accepted her hand and allowed her to pull him upright, his usual swagger completely absent. Tom and Liam remained on the floor, still trying to catch their breath and make sense of how their carefully planned intimidation had turned into their complete humiliation. Jake started, then stopped. For the first time in years, he found himself at a complete loss for words. Sarah waited patiently, her posture relaxed but alert. The gymnasium had filled with more students drawn by rumors and the irresistible appeal of witnessing their school's most notorious bullies receive their comeuppance. But Sarah seemed oblivious to the audience, her attention focused entirely on the three boys who had made her first weeks at Washington High School a trial by fire. "Take your time," she said quietly. "But I want an honest answer. Not the tough guy act, not the performance for your friends. I want to know why you decided I was your enemy before you even knew who I was." Jake looked around at the crowd of students, many of whom were still recording with their phones. His reputation, built over years of careful intimidation and strategic bullying, lay in tatters on the gymnasium floor. But something in Sarah's voice, some quality of genuine interest rather than judgment, made him want to answer honestly. "You were small," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "and new, and you looked nice, like you actually cared about teaching us. And that made you angry." Jake's throat worked as he struggled with emotions he'd spent years suppressing. "It made me scared." The admission hung in the air like a confession in church. Tom and Liam, who had finally managed to sit up, stared at their leader in shock. Jake Morrison didn't admit to being scared of anything. Fear was weakness, and weakness was what they preyed upon in others. "Scared of what?" Sarah asked gently. "Scared that you'd figure out how stupid I am." Jake said the words coming faster now as if a dam had burst. "Scared that you'd try to help me and I'd just fail anyway. Scared that you'd give up on me like everyone else does." Sarah's expression softened, and she moved to sit cross-legged on the floor, bringing herself down to Jake's eye level. It was a gesture that transformed the confrontation into something more intimate and therapeutic. "Jake, look at me," she said. When he reluctantly met her eyes, she continued, "You're not stupid. You're angry or hurt, and you've been using intimidation to protect yourself from getting hurt worse. But you're not stupid. My dad says I am," Jake mumbled. "Says I'm worthless. Says I'll never amount to anything." The piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Sarah. She'd seen it before: children who were victims at home, becoming victimizers at school, perpetuating cycles of abuse and pain, because it was the only model of power they'd ever learned. "Your father is wrong," Sarah said simply. "And more than that, he's failing you as a parent. Parents are supposed to build their children up, not tear them down." Jake's eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back for years. But what if he's right? What if I really am just a screw-up who ruins everything? Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were Jake's academic records from his previous school's documentation she'd requested as part of her preparation for dealing with his behavior. "You tested as gifted in elementary school," she said, showing him the papers. "Your IQ is in the top 10% of your age group. You have learning differences that have never been properly addressed, but you are absolutely not stupid." Sahtud. Jake stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. "But I fail everything. I can't read good. I can't write papers." "You can't read well," Sarah corrected gently. "And you can't write papers because no one has ever taught you strategies for managing dyslexia. But Jake, some of the smartest people in the world have dyslexia. They just need different approaches to learning." The conversation was interrupted by movement in the crowd. Emma Rodriguez had pushed through the ring of students and was approaching the group cautiously. In her hands, she carried a small video camera. "Ms. Miller," Emma said, her voice nervous but determined, "I recorded everything. The fight, but also this conversation. If Jake wants, I can delete it. But if he doesn't mind, I think other people should hear what you just said about being smart in different ways." Jake looked up at Emma, the same girl he'd been bullying since the beginning of the school year. She was offering to protect his privacy, despite everything he'd put her through. The gesture hit him like a physical blow. "I'm sorry," he said to Emma, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry for everything I did to you. You didn't deserve any of it." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "Thank you for saying that, Jake. It means a lot." Sarah stood up and looked around at the assembled students. What had started as a confrontation between a teacher and her tormentors had become something much more significant, a moment of genuine human connection and the possibility of real change. "Everyone out except Jake, Tom, and Liam," she announced. "We have some things to discuss privately." As the crowd dispersed, many students patting Jake on the shoulder or offering words of encouragement, Sarah turned back to the three boys who were slowly getting to their feet. "Here's what's going to happen," she said. "You're going to help me start a program for students who are struggling academically. We're going to create a safe space where kids can get help without being judged or labeled. And you're going to learn that real strength comes from lifting others up, not putting them down." Tom spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. "What if we mess it up? What if we're not good at helping people?" Sarah smiled. "Then we'll learn together. That's what teachers and students do. We figure things out as we go along." 3 months later, the after-school program that Jake Morrison had helped establish was serving 47 students at Washington High School. The Learning Lab, as it had come to be known, provided tutoring support, study skills training, and most importantly, a community where struggling students could find acceptance and encouragement. Jake had discovered that his experiences with academic challenges made him an exceptionally effective peer tutor. His ability to understand frustration and his hard-won strategies for managing learning differences allowed him to connect with students who had been written off by more traditional educational approaches. The key, Jake explained to a group of ninth graders who were struggling with reading comprehension, is not to feel stupid when you don't get it right away. Your brain just processes information differently, and that's not a bad thing. It's just different. Sarah watched from across the room as Jake worked with his tutoring group. The transformation had been remarkable. The angry, defensive bully had evolved into a confident young man who took pride in helping others succeed. His grades had improved dramatically once he began receiving appropriate support for his dyslexia, and more importantly, his relationships with other students had changed completely. Tom and Liam had undergone similar transformations. Tom had discovered a talent for mathematics that had been hidden beneath years of behavior problems, while Liam had found his voice as a peer mediator, helping resolve conflicts between students before they escalated into more serious confrontations. But perhaps the most significant change was in the overall culture of the school. The story of the English teacher who had confronted her bullies and then transformed them into community leaders had spread throughout the district. Other teachers began requesting transfers to Washington High School, drawn by reports of innovative programs and positive student engagement. Ms. Miller, Emma Rodriguez, approached Sarah's desk after the day's tutoring session had ended. "I have something for you." Emma handed Sarah a manila envelope that seemed to contain something substantial. Inside, Sarah found a leather-bound photo album filled with pictures of learning lab activities, student achievements, and candid moments of connection and growth. "We all contributed," Emma explained. "Everyone wanted to show you how much the program means to us. But there's something else." She flipped to the back of the album where a letter was carefully mounted on the final page. It was written in Jake's careful handwriting, the result of months of practice and patience as he learned to manage his dyslexia. "Dear Ms. Miller," the letter began, "before you came to our school, I thought being strong meant making other people afraid of me. I thought if I could control people through fear, that would protect me from getting hurt. I was wrong about everything. You taught me that real strength is helping other people become stronger. You taught me that being smart doesn't mean being perfect, it means being willing to learn and grow. Most importantly, you taught me that I have value even when I make mistakes. I know I can never take back the way I treated you and other students, but I want to spend the rest of my time at this school proving that people can change and that everyone deserves a chance to be better than their worst moments. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I had given up on myself. Thank you for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Thank you for showing me what it really means to be strong. Your student, Jake Morrison." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes as she read the letter. The journey from that first day when Jake had thrown a paper ball at her head to this moment of genuine gratitude and growth felt like a testament to the power of persistence, compassion, and the willingness to see potential in even the most challenging students. "There's one more thing," Emma said, pulling out her phone. "Jake wanted to show you something." The video Emma played showed Jake speaking to a group of middle school students about bullying prevention. His message was simple but powerful. Bullying doesn't make you strong. It just makes you someone who hurts other people, because you're hurting inside. Real strength is when you help someone else feel better about themselves. After the video ended, Sarah sat in quiet contemplation. Her journey at Washington High School had begun with harassment, and threats evolved through confrontation and conflict, and culminated in transformation and growth. It was a reminder that sometimes the most challenging students were simply those who needed the most support and understanding. Jake appeared in the doorway of the learning lab, no longer the swaggering bully who had dominated the back of her classroom, but a confident young man who carried himself with genuine pride. "Ms. Miller," he said, "I just wanted to thank you again for everything, for not backing down, for fighting back, and for showing me that fighting back doesn't always mean what I thought it meant." "You did the hard work, Jake," Sarah replied. "I just provided the opportunity." "Maybe," Jake said with a smile, "but I never would have found that opportunity if you hadn't been brave enough to stand up to me. Sometimes people need someone to believe in them before they can believe in themselves." As Jake walked away, Sarah reflected on the lessons she'd learned during her first semester at Washington High School. Sometimes the most effective way to deal with bullies wasn't to avoid confrontation, but to meet it head-on while maintaining compassion for the pain that drove their behavior. Her black belt in Taekwondo had been useful for getting Jake's attention, but her commitment to seeing his potential had been what ultimately changed his life. The combination of strength and compassion, discipline, and empathy had created the possibility for transformation that might not have existed otherwise. The Learning Lab continued to thrive, expanding to serve students throughout the district and inspiring similar programs at other schools. Sarah's innovative approach to dealing with challenging students became a model for other educators, demonstrating that sometimes the best way to address behavioral problems was to address the underlying academic and emotional needs that drove them. Years later, when Jake Morrison graduated from college with a degree in education and returned to Washington High School as a teacher himself, he would often tell the story of the English teacher who had refused to be intimidated and had instead chosen to see the frightened child hiding behind the bully's mask. "She could have destroyed me," he would say. "She had every right to have me expelled, to press charges, to make sure I faced serious consequences for my behavior. Instead, she chose to show me that I was worth saving. That decision changed my entire life." The story of Sarah Miller and Jake Morrison became legendary at Washington High School, a reminder that real strength isn't about the ability to defeat others, but about the courage to help them become their best selves. It was proof that sometimes the most transformative moments come not from avoiding conflict, but from facing it with both firmness and compassion. And in a world where bullying often seemed like an intractable problem, their story offered hope that understanding persistence and the willingness to see potential in even the most challenging individuals could create change that lasted far beyond a single confrontation in a high school gymnasium.